never planned to stay in the cabin for long. I just needed a quiet place to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city. My uncle had left it to me in his will, a small one-room structure deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. I never knew him well, but when I saw the place for the first time, I understood why he had chosen to live out here alone. It was peaceful. No traffic, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. It was the middle of January when I arrived. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the only way in was by snowmobile. I had packed enough supplies to last 2 weeks: canned food, bottled water, extra fuel, batteries, and a thick sleeping bag. The cabin itself was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a cot pushed against the wall. There was a shed out back where my uncle had kept tools, along with a small supply of firewood. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading, chopping wood, and exploring the area around the cabin. The snow made everything feel still, like the whole world had been put on pause. At night, the temperature dropped fast. I kept the wood stove burning, listening to the crackling of the fire as I lay in my sleeping bag. But on the 5th night, things changed. I had just finished eating a can of chili and was sitting by the fire when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, a deep, hollow sound moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A heavy crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow. I set my spoon down and reached for the flashlight. The cabin had no windows, just a thick wooden door with a small peephole. I moved to it slowly, my breath fogging up the wood as I pressed my eye against the hole. Darkness. Nothing but the shadows of trees, their branches shifting slightly in the wind. I waited, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a moose passing through. I shook off the feeling and went back to the cot, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were human, not boot prints, bare feet. The snow had softened the edges, but I could see the shape of toes, the curve of an arch. They led from the tree line to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the door. Whoever it was, they had stood there for a long time before walking back into the woods. I felt a chill run through me. No one lived out here. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. If someone was walking around barefoot in the snow, they wouldn't last long. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But the woods were empty. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I checked my supplies, made sure the door was locked, and kept the shotgun close. I had brought it more as a precaution against bears, but now it felt like a necessary comfort. That night, I kept the fire going and tried to stay awake, but at some point, I must have drifted off. Then the sound came again. This time it was closer, a slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The shotgun was already in my lap. I moved to the peephole, my hands sweating despite the cold. A shape stood outside. A man, tall, thin, naked. His skin was pale, almost blending in with the snow. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. I swallowed hard. My breath felt trapped in my throat. Then he took a step forward. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a log from the fire and jammed it against the peephole, blocking the view. My hands were shaking. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps came closer. Then they stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The fire crackled. The wind howled against the walls. I didn't dare look outside. When the sun came up, I finally forced myself to check. He was gone, but the footprints remained. This time, they led around the cabin, circling it again and again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, fueled up the snowmobile, and left as fast as I could. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing at the tree line, watching. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if he ever really stopped following me. This is just the start of a longer version. Let me know if you want an extended version, and I'll add more details, build up, and tension. I drove up the mountain in a truck packed full of supplies, tires crunching over the gravel road as the trees thickened on both sides. It was a long way from town, deep enough into the forest that there was no cell service. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. 1 week alone in my uncle's old hunting cabin. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a few shelves lined with dusty cans of food. He had built it years ago and used it every fall, but since he passed, no one had been back. I figured it would be a good place to clear my head. No people, no distractions. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. A narrow trail led into the woods behind it, where my uncle used to hunt. The moment I stepped inside, I smelled the wood, old pine mixed with the faint scent of ashes from the last fire he had burned. The cot in the corner was still made up, the blanket stiff with age. A lantern sat on a table beside it. I unpacked my food, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and made sure the woodpile out back was stocked. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. It was the kind of silence that took a while to get used to. The first couple of days passed slowly. I spent my time exploring, hiking the trails behind the cabin. I found an old tree stand about a half-mile in, overlooking a narrow stream. My uncle must have used it for hunting. There were rusted beer cans at the base, half buried in the dirt. That night, I sat by the wood stove watching the fire flicker. The heat felt good against the cold creeping in through the walls. I ate a can of soup, read a few pages of an old book I had brought, and fell asleep early. Then, on the third day, I noticed something strange. I had gone out to collect firewood from the shed when I saw footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter, like someone had walked barefoot across the clearing. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, then disappeared around the back. I stopped, heart pounding, and looked toward the woods. Nothing. The forest was still, the trees unmoving. I followed the prints, stepping carefully through the snow. They went around the cabin, stopping at the back wall. Then they vanished. I searched the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The tracks were fresh. They hadn't been there the day before. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire burning, listening for sounds outside. I told myself it could have been an animal. Maybe the prints just looked human. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the next morning, I found something worse. The footprints were back, and this time they led to the door. They stopped just short of the wooden steps, like someone had stood there watching. The snow was disturbed, packed down in a way that suggested they had been there for a long time. I grabbed the shotgun from the wall. It was my uncle's, an old 12-gauge pump action. I checked the shells, loaded it, and stepped outside. My breath curled in the freezing air. I followed the prints again, but they vanished into the trees. No sign of anyone. That day, I carried the shotgun with me everywhere. Even inside the cabin, I kept it close. I started locking the door with the thick metal latch at night. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't going to take any chances. On the fifth night, I woke to a sound outside. It was soft at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. A faint crunching in the snow. I sat up, gripping the shotgun. My heart was hammering. The sound grew closer. Slow, deliberate steps. Then silence. I held my breath. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Then, Just as I started to think I had imagined it, there was a soft thump against the door. I nearly pulled the trigger out of reflex. I stayed completely still. The air in the cabin felt heavier, like something was pressing in on me. Then, another thump, lighter this time, like fingers tapping against the wood. I gritted my teeth, raised the shotgun, and stepped toward the door. I waited. The tapping stopped. I reached for the lantern, gripping the handle with a shaky hand. Then, slowly, I lifted it to the peephole. For a second, I saw nothing but darkness. The firelight barely reached past the porch. But then, movement. A shape, standing just beyond the glow of the lantern. Thin, motionless, watching. I stumbled back, heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't care what it was. I grabbed the shotgun, unlocked the door, and yanked it open. The cold air hit me like a slap. I raised the gun, ready to fire. But there was nothing there, just the empty clearing, the wind moving through the trees. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkness. No footprints in the fresh snow. No sign of anything. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gun in my lap, listening. But there was nothing else. No more sounds. At sunrise, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. By the time I reached the truck, my fingers were numb from gripping the shotgun so tightly. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and peeled out onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear it again. That soft thump against my bedroom window. And I know deep down that whatever was out there that night followed me home. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in my friend's hunting cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. No cell service, no traffic, no people, just the quiet of the forest. He had let me borrow the place before, and I knew it well. It was small, built decades ago by his grandfather, nothing fancy. Just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table. It had everything I needed. I drove out early in the morning, my truck packed with supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a few basic tools, and my rifle. The dirt road wound deep into the woods, the trees growing thicker as I went. The last stretch was barely a road at all, just a narrow path of packed-down earth that cut through the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. It looked the same as I remembered, weathered wood, a metal chimney, and a small porch out front. The forest was quiet except for the sound of the wind moving through the branches. I unloaded my supplies, stacked firewood near the door, and went inside. Dust floated in the air, catching the afternoon light. Everything was just as I had left it the last time. The cot against the wall, the shelves lined with old camping gear, the hunting knife stuck into the wooden table. I set up my sleeping bag and started a fire in the stove. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon exploring, following an old game trail down to the creek. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground and the occasional snap of a branch. That night, I sat by the fire, listening to the wood crackle. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak. I fell asleep easily, the warmth of the stove keeping the cold at bay. But on the second night, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It was faint, barely noticeable over the wind. A soft crunching in the snow, like footsteps. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light across the wooden walls. My breath felt loud in the silence. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. It was close, just outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I reached for the rifle, my fingers stiff with cold. Silence. I waited, my ears straining for any sound. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint creak of the trees. I got up, moving quietly to the small window. The glass was fogged from the heat inside, so I wiped it with my sleeve. Outside, the snow-covered clearing was empty. The moon cast long shadows through the trees. Nothing moved. I stood there for a long time, watching. My heart was still racing. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer passing through, its hooves crunching in the snow. Maybe a branch had fallen. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the snow. There were footprints. They started at the tree line and led straight to the cabin. They were human, deep impressions in the snow the size of a man's boot. But there was only one set, no tracks leading away. I felt a tightness in my chest as I stared at them. Whoever had made them had walked up to the cabin and stopped. They hadn't left. I gripped the rifle tighter and scanned the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent. I followed the tracks, my breath clouding in the cold air. They stopped just short of the front steps, like someone had stood there for a long time, watching. I checked the entire clearing, looking for more tracks, but found none. I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was still out there, hidden in the trees, watching. I went back inside and locked the door. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I kept the rifle within arm's reach, checking the window every few minutes. I didn't leave the cabin. That night, I kept the fire burning high. The light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. I forced myself to stay awake. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to another sound. This time, it was different. Not footsteps, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the snow. I gripped the rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. The noise stopped, then soft, deliberate tapping against the wooden door. I held my breath. The tapping came again. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. My finger hovered over the trigger. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, the fire burned low again, and the room grew colder. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, my stomach twisted. The footprints were back. But now there were two sets, one leading to the cabin, and another, smaller set leading away. But the second set wasn't made by boots. They were bare feet. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care how long the drive back would be. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded the truck, keeping the rifle in the passenger seat. As I turned onto the narrow dirt road, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. A figure, thin, barely visible between the trunks. Watching, I hit the gas, speeding down the path, my heart hammering. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my friend about it, never told him what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, and I wonder if whatever was out there that night had been waiting for someone like me. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a full 7 days alone in the woods, just me, my gear, and the cabin. No phone calls, no emails, no people, just silence. I needed it. My life had been a mess lately, and the thought of getting away from everything was the only thing keeping me sane. The cabin belonged to a friend of my father's. I had been there once before, years ago, when I was a kid. It was a simple place, deep in the forest near Dead River, about 30 miles from the nearest town. It was remote, no cell service, no running water, just a wood stove and an old well out back. The perfect place to disappear for a while. I packed everything carefully. Canned food, bottled water, a rifle, extra ammunition, a first aid kit, batteries, and plenty of firewood. The drive took nearly 3 hours, most of it on rough dirt roads. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. It looked the same as I remembered, A small, one-room structure with a porch, set in a clearing surrounded by thick pines. The wood was weathered, the roof patched with sheets of rusted metal. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust floated in the air, catching the last light of the day. The cot was still against the wall, the old wood stove in the corner. There were a few shelves lined with canned goods and an old hunting knife stuck into the table. I set my bag down and got to work. I swept out the dust, stacked my supplies neatly, and got a fire going in the stove. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could already see my breath in the air. I ate a can of chili straight from the can, washed it down with bottled water, and stretched out on the cot, listening to the fire crackle. The silence was almost unsettling. I had grown used to city noise, the constant hum of traffic and voices. Out here, there was nothing but the occasional creak of the trees in the wind. That night, I slept deeply, the warmth of the fire keeping the cold at bay. But the next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They were in the snow just outside the cabin. Human, deep impressions leading from the woods to the edge of the porch. I felt my pulse quicken as I scanned the trees. There was no sign of anyone. The prints weren't mine. I had worn heavy boots, and these were smaller, lighter, like someone had been walking barefoot. I followed them, my breath clouding in the cold air. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where the tracks vanished. My fingers tightened around the rifle slung over my shoulder. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker, someone passing through. But deep down, I knew how unlikely that was. No one came out here. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched, but it lingered at the back of my mind. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself scanning the trees, searching for movement. That night, I kept the fire burning high. I lay on the cot, the rifle within arm's reach. I must have drifted off, because I woke suddenly to a noise outside. A soft, deliberate crunch in the snow. My body went rigid. I reached for the rifle, my fingers cold and stiff. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Another step, then another. I held my breath, ears straining. The sound stopped just outside the door. A long silence, then soft, deliberate tapping against the wood. My heart pounded. I gripped the rifle tighter, staring at the door. The tapping came again, slow, rhythmic. I didn't move. I stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, my body tense, every muscle coiled. Then silence. I waited, breath shallow. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I forced myself to move, standing slowly, my knees stiff. I crept toward the door and pressed my ear against the wood. Nothing. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to check outside. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, rifle raised. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still, but the footprints were back. They led up to the door, then away again, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Someone had been out here, watching, waiting. I slammed the door shut, bolting it. The rest of the night, I sat by the fire, the rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things quickly, throwing them into my bag without care. I stepped outside, scanning the trees one last time. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, something moved. A figure standing still, watching. I turned and ran for the truck, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the snow as I tore down the dirt road, not daring to look back. By the time I reached town, my hands were still shaking. I never went back, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes late at night I still hear it. The the soft tapping against the wood. And I know deep down that whatever was out there that night, it hasn't forgotten me. I don't know what made me take the trip. Maybe I wanted some time alone, away from the noise of my life. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. Spend a week alone in the wilderness, miles away from anyone, with nothing but my own thoughts. I had been to the cabin once before. It belonged to an old coworker of mine, a guy named Rick who I barely kept in touch with anymore. He had inherited it from his grandfather, and since he barely used it, he told me I could borrow it any time. It was deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest paved road. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a cot, and an old outhouse a few yards behind the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The kind of place where, once you got there, you didn't see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out was uneventful. The last stretch of road was rough, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the trees. My truck's tires kicked up rocks as I made my way up the winding trail, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. I stepped out of the truck and stretched my legs, breathing in the crisp, cool air. The place looked exactly as I remembered. Weathered wood, a slanted tin roof, the front porch sagging slightly. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, dust floating in the fading sunlight that filtered through the small window. The cot was against the far wall, next to a wood-burning stove. A single wooden chair sat near the table, which still had a few old hunting knives stuck into the surface. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods and a few supplies Rick had left behind. I set my bag down and got to work. I swept out the dust, stacked my food neatly on the shelves, and gathered firewood from the small pile outside. The place had no generator, so I relied on lanterns and a flashlight once the sun set. The first night passed without issue. I made a fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustling in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. No traffic noise, no hum of electricity, no voices, just silence. It was peaceful. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin that led down to a creek. The water was clear, moving slow over smooth stones. I crouched down, splashing some of it on my face, letting the cold wake me up. I spent most of the day hiking, making my way through the thick trees, keeping my bearings by the position of the sun. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in a small, overgrown clearing. There were no trails leading to it, no signs that anyone had been there in a long time. And yet, there was something there, a structure. At first, I thought it was just another cabin, but as I stepped closer, I saw that it was something else. A shack built from old, rotting wood, leaning slightly to one side. It looked abandoned, the door hanging slightly open. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The ground in front of it was uneven, patches of grass growing up through the dirt. I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. The place was empty, just a small, single-room structure. The walls were bare, except for deep scratches running along the wood. The floor was covered in dead leaves, dirt, and animal droppings. I felt uneasy. There was no reason for a place like this to be out here. It wasn't a hunter's cabin. There was no stove, no furniture, just four walls and a roof. And those scratches, they weren't random. They were deep, deliberate, like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood over and over again. I backed out of the shack, my skin crawling. The air felt colder than before, the forest suddenly too quiet. I made my way back to the cabin faster than I intended, my footsteps crunching against the forest floor. I told myself it was nothing, just an old shack someone had built and abandoned long ago. But something about it stuck with me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the wooden walls. Then I heard it, a sound outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The rifle was within arm's reach, but I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across wood. My throat went dry. I sat up slowly, reaching for the rifle, my fingers stiff with cold. Silence. I waited, ears straining. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cabin. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, my body tense, my eyes locked on the door. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was seeping through the window. I got up, moving cautiously to the door. When I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints, leading from the treeline to the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and they stopped just short of the porch. I felt my stomach tighten as I followed them with my eyes. They didn't lead away. Whoever had made them had walked up to the cabin, stood there for who knows how long, then vanished. I didn't hesitate. I packed my things in minutes, throwing everything into my bag, barely checking to make sure I had everything. I didn't care. I locked the cabin behind me, even though I knew it didn't matter. Whatever had been out there hadn't been trying to get inside. It had just been watching. I climbed into my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The tires spun in the snow for a moment before catching, and then I was moving, the cabin disappearing behind me as I sped down the narrow dirt road. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the highway, my breathing had finally started to slow. I kept telling myself I had imagined it, that the footprints had been mine, distorted by the wind, the night playing tricks on me. But I knew the truth. Something had been out there, watching, waiting, and I had no intention of ever finding out what it wanted. I don't know why I took the job. Maybe I needed the money. Maybe I just wanted an excuse to disappear for a while. It was supposed to be simple. Spend a week at a remote hunting cabin, maintain the property, keep an eye out for trespassers, and report anything unusual. The owner, a man named Daniel Wren, had inherited the place from his grandfather, but barely used it anymore. He didn't want squatters moving in, didn't want the place falling apart. I didn't ask many questions. He wired me half the money up front, told me the rest would come when I got back. The cabin was deep in the woods of Black Hollow, miles away from anything. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove, a well out back, and a radio that barely worked. I brought everything I'd need: canned food, water, a rifle, extra batteries, and a thick coat. The nights were supposed to get cold. The drive took nearly 4 hours. The last 30 miles were nothing but winding dirt roads, cutting through thick forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches clawing at the sky. It had been a mild winter, but the temperature was already dropping. Patches of snow still clung to the ground in the shady spots. I reached the cabin just before sunset. It was smaller than I expected. Just a single room with a slanted tin roof and a small porch. The wood was old, dark with age, but sturdy. The door was locked, just like Wren said it would be. I used the key he gave me, pushing it open with a low creak. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. There was a cot against the wall, an iron stove in the corner, and a few shelves lined with canned food that looked years old. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, neatly arranged. I dropped my bag on the cot and took a deep breath. It was quiet, too quiet. No traffic noise, No distant hum of power lines, just the wind whispering through the trees. I unpacked my things, set up my lantern, and got a fire going in the stove. It took a while for the place to warm up, but once it did, I started to feel comfortable. That night, I sat on the porch, eating a can of beans straight from the can. The forest stretched out in every direction, dark and endless. The wind rustled the branches, making them sway like they were moving on their own. I didn't see any trespassers, no signs that anyone had been here in a long time, just the trees, the cold air, and the sound of my own breathing. The first night passed without issue, but the next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had worn heavy boots, and these prints were smaller, lighter, barefoot. They started at the edge of the clearing, weaving through the snow and dirt, stopping just short of the porch. Whoever made them had stood there for a long time, watching. I scanned the woods, my pulse quickening. Nothing moved. The trees stood still. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hiker had wandered through days ago, before the snow melted. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them when I arrived. But I knew that wasn't true. I spent the day checking the area. I followed the footprints until they vanished into the trees. There were no signs of a camp, no tracks leading deeper into the woods. It was like someone had walked up to the cabin, stood there, then disappeared. That night, I locked the door. I kept my rifle close, my ears straining for any sound. The wind picked up, making the branches scrape against the roof. I stared at the ceiling, listening, waiting. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A soft sound, something moving outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the snow. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slowly, reaching for the rifle. The footsteps stopped. A long silence. Then, a soft tap against the door. Once, then twice. Not a knock, just a tap, like someone dragging their fingers across the wood. I gripped the rifle tighter, my knuckles white. My heart was hammering against my ribs, my breathing shallow. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Finally, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, the rifle across my lap. When the first light seeped through the window, I forced myself to move. I unlocked the door, pulling it open with stiff fingers. The clearing was empty, but the footprints were back, leading up to the door. And this time, they didn't lead away. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and locked the cabin behind me. The drive back felt longer. The trees seemed closer, the road narrower. Every shadow felt like something moving. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were still shaking. I never told Ren what happened. Never told anyone. But sometimes late at night I still hear it. The soft tap against the door. And I know deep down that whatever was out there that night is still waiting. I should have turned back when I saw the first sign. It was early October when I set out for my last solo hunting trip of the season. The weather had just started to turn, the nights colder, the wind sharper. I was heading deep into a stretch of national forest in Montana, far from any marked trails, looking for elk. I had been in this area before, but never this deep, never this far from the main roads. That was the whole point. I wanted the isolation, the kind you can only find miles from the nearest person. I was prepared. I had my rifle, my pack, enough food for 5 days, a water filter, a GPS, and a satellite phone in case of emergency. I packed light, moved fast. I had done this before. I thought I knew what I was doing. I had no idea what was waiting for me. Day 1, the first day, was perfect. I started early, hiking in before sunrise, moving through dense pine forests and up into the higher ridges. The terrain was rough, steep slopes, loose rocks, fallen trees, but nothing I wasn't used to. By noon, I was deep in the backcountry, further than I had ever been. I found fresh elk tracks by a creek, heading west. I followed them for miles, through thick brush and up a rocky incline. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth thick in my nose. I moved slow, quiet, scanning the trees, listening for movement. Then I saw it. Not an elk, a cabin. It was old, half hidden in the trees, its roof sagging, the wood dark with age. It wasn't on any map. I don't know why, but I walked toward it. The door was gone. The inside was empty except for a rusted wood stove and a single chair. A strange feeling settled in my gut. I turned and left. I had a bad taste in my mouth the rest of the day. I set up camp just before dark, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the fire, listening to the wind move through the trees. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I ignored it. I fell asleep with my rifle next to me. Day 2, I woke up early, packed up, and kept moving west, deeper into the mountains. The elk tracks were still fresh. I followed them through thick underbrush across a shallow stream, up another ridge. That's when I saw it. A footprint. Not an elk. A boot print. Deep, fresh. I wasn't alone. I stood there, staring at it, my pulse steady but heavy. The print was large. A man's. I hadn't seen anyone in 2 days. No vehicles, no other campsites, no signs of life. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I told myself it was just another hunter. I kept going. By late afternoon, I spotted movement in the trees ahead. I dropped to a crouch, raising my rifle. Elk. A bull, big, moving slow through the trees. I steadied my breath, lined up my shot. Then I saw something else. Something in the trees behind it. A figure. Still. Watching. I lowered my rifle. The elk moved on, disappearing into the trees. But the figure stayed. I stared, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A man, standing just inside the tree line, too far to make out details. Not moving, just watching. I raised my rifle again, not to shoot, just to see better through the scope. He was gone. Just like that, I felt a slow, creeping fear settle into my chest. I scanned the trees for another 10 minutes. Nothing. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me. I moved fast the rest of the day, putting miles between me and that spot. That night, I built my fire high. I kept my rifle in my lap. I barely slept. Day 3, I woke up to find something missing. Not my food, not my gear, my footprints. The ground around my tent was smooth. No tracks, like someone had brushed them away. I stared at the dirt, my stomach twisting. Someone had been in my camp. I scanned the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. Nothing. I packed fast and moved out. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I just wanted to get out. I pushed hard, covering miles, not stopping to rest. The whole time I felt eyes on me. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. I'd hear it, a soft snap of a branch, the faint rustle of leaves, always behind me, following. By late afternoon, I reached a steep ravine. The only way down was through a narrow, rocky path. I started down carefully, my boots sliding on loose gravel. Halfway down, I slipped. I caught myself on a tree root, my knee slamming into rock. Pain flared up my leg. I gritted my teeth, pulled myself up, and froze. There, in the dirt, a rope, thin, stretched across the trail, hidden under leaves. A trap. My blood turned to ice. I looked up at the trees. Nothing. But I knew. Someone had set this. For me. I scrambled down the rest of the way, ignoring the pain in my knee. I didn't stop moving. Couldn't. Day 4, I didn't sleep. I hiked through the night, my flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. I had no plan, no direction, just a way. By sunrise, I was near the base of the mountains, close to an old service road. I was almost out. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close. I turned fast, rifle raised. Nothing. Then I saw them, two figures half hidden in the trees, watching. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran harder than I ever have in my life. Branches tore at my arms. My pack bounced on my shoulders. I heard them behind me, running. Fast. Closing in. The trees thinned. A road. An old logging road, but a road. Then an engine. A truck. I stumbled onto the dirt, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a stop. An old man behind the wheel, eyes wide. I turned back. The figures were gone. Just trees. Just silence. I climbed into the truck, my hands shaking. The old man didn't ask questions. He just drove. I never went back. The cabin had been in my family for generations. My grandfather built it back in the 1950s, a small, sturdy structure deep in the woods of northern Maine. He used it for hunting, and later my father would take us there in the summers. I had good memories of the place, though it had been years since I last visited. When my father passed away, the cabin became mine. It was more of a burden than a gift. I had no use for it, no desire to spend time in the woods. But after my divorce, I needed a break from the world. I needed silence, space, a place to think. So I packed my truck with supplies: canned food, bottled water, a rifle, extra blankets, and enough firewood to last a week. I left early, hoping to reach the cabin before nightfall. The drive was long and lonely. The last hour was nothing but dirt roads, winding through thick forest. The trees were tall and close, their bare branches tangling together overhead. It was late October, the air cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of decaying leaves. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was weathered, the roof patched with rusted tin. There was a porch out front, its steps sagging under years of neglect. The windows were grimy, the glass cracked in places. I parked the truck beside the cabin and got out, the air biting at my face. It was quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. No traffic noise, no hum of power lines, just the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. The inside was dark and musty, the air stale from being closed up for so long. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table and a single chair. The wood stove sat in the corner, next to a pile of firewood. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the old cot was tucked away. I dropped my bag on the table and took a deep breath. This was what I wanted: time alone, away from everything. Settling in the first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, heated up a can of soup, and sat at the table, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the wind picked up, making the cabin creak and groan. The trees swayed in the darkness, their branches scraping against the roof. I went to bed early, burrowed deep in my sleeping bag. The loft was drafty, the old cot sagging in the middle, but I was too tired to care. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. In the morning, I woke up to a cold, gray light seeping through the window. I made coffee on the old propane stove and sat on the porch, looking out at the trees. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The only sign of civilization was the narrow dirt path that led back to the road. I spent the day exploring. There were old trails leading through the woods, barely visible under layers of fallen leaves. I followed one down to the river, its water dark and sluggish, choked with fallen branches. The air was still, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. On my way back, I noticed something strange. A tree near the cabin had deep cuts in its bark. They were old, the wood scarred and darkened, but they formed a distinct pattern. 3 slashes, one above the other, like something had clawed at the tree long ago. I ran my fingers over the marks, the wood rough under my touch. I had never seen them before, never noticed them as a kid. It was probably nothing, just damage from some long-gone animal. I shook off the unease and headed back to the cabin, the wind picking up again, rustling the leaves around my feet. The first night that night, I kept the fire burning high. The stove glowed with heat, casting flickering light across the walls. I sat by the window, watching the darkness outside, trying to let the quiet settle my mind. But the silence was heavy, oppressive. I climbed into the loft early, the rifle resting against the wall within arm's reach. I didn't think I'd need it, but it was comforting to have it close. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, hollow sound moving through the trees. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, ears straining, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. A long silence. Then the faintest tap against the window. Once, then again. Slow, rhythmic. I reached for the rifle, my hands shaking. I stayed frozen, listening. The tapping stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, I drifted off again, my body too tired to stay awake. The second day in the morning, I found the tracks. They were human, barefoot. They led from the tree line to the cabin, circling around it, stopping just below the loft window. My stomach twisted as I stared at them. They weren't mine, and they were fresh, the edges sharp in the frost. I scanned the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching from the shadows. But the trees were empty. I spent the day on edge, checking the windows, testing the locks, making sure the rifle was loaded. The forest felt darker, the trees pressing in close. That night, I locked the door, pulled the chair against it, and kept the rifle in my lap as I sat by the stove. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening for the slightest sound, the wind howling against the cabin, the branches scraping against the roof. But nothing came. I needed time away from everything. Work, people, the city. I had to clear my head. A friend had a cabin deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. He used it for hunting trips, but it sat empty most of the year. When I asked if I could use it for a while, he handed me the keys without hesitation. "There's no phone service out there," he warned, "and it's a rough drive. You sure you're up for it?" That was exactly what I wanted. I packed what I needed: canned food, bottled water, a rifle, extra clothes, and enough firewood to last a week. Then I drove out, following a narrow dirt road into the mountains. The further I went, the rougher the road became, the trees closing in on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was sinking low behind the peaks. The place was smaller than I expected. Just one room with a loft, a wood stove in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs. The windows were grimy, the wooden walls worn from years of wind and rain. It was perfect. I unpacked, locked the truck, and got the fire going. The wind had picked up outside, rustling the trees, sending leaves skittering across the ground. The sound was oddly soothing. I didn't think much about the footprints until later. At first, I assumed they were mine, just the marks I left while walking back and forth from the truck. But when I went outside to grab more firewood, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the tree line, barefoot. They led toward the cabin, then stopped a few feet from the porch. No return tracks. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The prints were deep, the toes splayed out, pressed into the damp earth. It had rained 2 days before. These tracks were fresh. A chill crept up my spine. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe some hiker had passed through earlier. Maybe they turned around and walked back the way they came, stepping exactly in their old footprints. I didn't believe that, but I went inside, locked the door, and told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I kept the rifle close. I told myself it was just a precaution. The second NIGHT the next morning, I checked the footprints again. They were still there, unchanged. Nothing new. I spent the day hiking. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick with dead leaves and tangled roots. I followed an old trail up into the hills, the air crisp, the sky heavy with clouds. I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed, hidden among the trees. Inside, I found empty beer cans, a rusted knife, and a torn sleeping bag. It looked like someone had used it recently, but not for hunting. A bad feeling settled in my gut. I turned back toward the cabin, moving faster than before. The woods felt different now, like they were pressing in on me. The silence was heavy, unnatural. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the mountains. That was when I saw the new footprints. They led from the same spot near the tree line, but this time they went all the way to the porch, right up to the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I unlocked the door, rifle in hand, and stepped inside, my breath coming fast and shallow. Nothing looked out of place, but the air felt wrong, like someone had been inside. I checked the windows, the corners, even the loft. The door had been locked. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, listening. The wind howled outside, the trees groaning under its weight. The cabin creaked, the old wood settling. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Soft, slow, footsteps, right outside the window. My blood turned to ice. I gripped the rifle, my hands slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped. I forced myself to breathe, to stay still. Then a single tap against the glass. Soft, deliberate. I didn't move. Another tap. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn. The third day, I checked the ground first thing in the morning. More footprints. They circled the cabin. Stopped at the door, stopped at the windows. I wasn't alone out here. I packed my things. I had enough food for a week, but I wasn't staying. The problem was the road. It was rough, winding through miles of thick forest. If I left now, I'd be driving at least an hour before I hit the highway. I hesitated. If someone was out there, watching, waiting, they'd see me leave. They could follow me. Maybe that was what they wanted. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. I decided to wait until morning. Leave at first light. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the locks, keeping the rifle close. I barely ate, barely moved. Night fell too fast. The fire burned low. Shadows stretched across the walls. Then the footsteps came back. This time they didn't stop at the windows. They went to the door. I heard the handle turn. Slow, testing, then stillness. A long, heavy silence. I held the rifle tight, every muscle locked in place. Then soft breathing, just on the other side of the door. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes, maybe an hour. Then footsteps, moving away. I didn't sleep. The final day at first light, I left. I opened the door, rifle raised, scanning the trees. The footprints were still there, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows. The forest was silent. I loaded my gear into the truck, my hands shaking, started the engine, backed up, tires crunching over gravel. Then, in the mirror, a figure, standing at the tree line, barefoot, watching. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept driving. Miles later, when I reached the highway, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't tell my friend what happened, didn't tell anyone. I just knew one thing. I was never going back.